from the NewsChannel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to OpenLine. Our topic tonight, the timing couldn't be any perfect. Earlier today, President Joe Biden signed a new piece of legislation that will officially establish our newest federal holiday as Juneteenth. But a lot of Americans don't exactly know what that is or why it's important, which is why we have our guest tonight, David Ewing, who is a Nashville historian, to help us break it all down. David, thanks so much for being here.
Chris, great to be here on OpenLine.
And I just have to note, this is our first official guest in person with us since the pandemic started back last March. So it is so good to actually have you here and to be able to ask you questions and have a conversation.
We're fully vaccinated, and it's great to be in this great mid-century building.
Absolutely, absolutely. So David, why don't we just start at what makes sense as the beginning of what is Juneteenth if people don't know what it is?
Juneteenth is something that African Americans exclusively in Texas would celebrate. And it goes back to the days of the Civil War that, of course, the end of the Civil War happened in April of 1865. And it took months and months and months for some people at Galveston, Texas, some African Americans, some formerly enslaved people, to know that the war was over and their freedom was granted. And so when one of the Union generals kind of went there and saw all these people, he got to announce, "You're free." They didn't know. They literally didn't know. And June 19th, later in the 20th century, was celebrated by the African American community as kind of a mark of freedom. And it's interesting, it was a regional holiday or state holiday. You might learn about it in Black History Month. Growing up, we really didn't have Juneteenth celebrations here in Nashville. But lately, in the last 5 or 10 years, Juneteenth has been this big kind of celebration all across the country, in states, in the African American community, and others too.
Absolutely. I mean, I know for myself, I've heard, I think the name, mentioned over the last couple of years, but I really feel like I got to know what it was last year with kind of some of the summer of demonstrations and conversations about race. I'm curious, when did Juneteenth kind of get on your radar?
No, I knew about it growing up. My mother's family was from Tuskegee, Alabama, where Booker T. Washington was. My grandmother's sister taught school down in Louisiana and Texas, and so I was very aware of Juneteenth and kind of all that it meant. It's you not only have to know kind of Southern history, but African American history too. I think one of the things that's really helped Juneteenth lately is a great brand. I mean, what a great name, Juneteenth. It just sounds good and it's kind of interesting, and so I think that really helped too.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, when did this really start to gain steam as just even a movement for it to become either a local, state, or national holiday? Kind of give us the background of the transition, where it kind of went from being regional in Texas or maybe in the South to being more of a national phenomenon.
It's really been on the last few years, and probably, as you said, after the murder of George Floyd, that people look at African American culture and important dates. The Tulsa massacre 100 years ago. A lot of people didn't know about that, but now, because of this, a lot of events in history that were just totally ignored are getting a lot of press. And what's interesting about Juneteenth is, I'm sure someone had introduced bills to make it a federal holiday, and there are lots of bills that get introduced all the time that go nowhere. And if you look what happened in the 80s, the problems that, they wanted Dr. King's birthday to be a national holiday. Well, Ronald Reagan wasn't for it, and a lot of people in the Senate and Congress weren't for it, and it kind of stalled for a little while. And then the NFL decided to take away the Super Bowl from Arizona because they had not recognized that it was a national holiday by then, but the state of Arizona didn't recognize it, so they literally lost the Super Bowl, and so that kind of changed everything. But I think through this era of post-George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and everything like that, people are now really interested more in Black culture and things like that. To be honest with you, I was surprised it passed so quickly, just looking at the problems, how hard it was to pass a holiday for Dr. King. I think it also has the benefit of being in a month where there's not a federal holiday, and Memorial Day is before, and I guess the next holiday is in July, 4th of July. So it kind of fits in the calendar nicely, too. I think that also helped.
Absolutely. I did a story last summer as Tennessee had a bill. You're talking about how, there are lots of different legislation to do different things. Tennessee had a bill in front of the legislature last year that did not pass that would have established it as an official state holiday. Right. But Tennessee does recognize it as one of the recognized holidays, I think is the right term to say. Like, it's not an official day off for state employees and state offices don't close, but it's kind of a recognized day. So I think it really is, as you're mentioning from the federal level, that the fact that this changed so quickly after such long efforts to be able to, for Martin Luther King Day and other things like that.
Tennessee, we used to recognize a lot of Civil War related holidays back up until like the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Robert E. Lee's birthday in January, Nathan Bedford Forrest's birthday, and then there was like a Confederate Veterans Day, and all were state holidays. Offices were closed, people got off work, and it's very interesting to see kind of what some states do, and then this federal holiday too now. And I think it's something that a lot of people obviously worked hard on, but now Juneteenth is now, June is African American Music History Month, so I think it also fits in there too. So it's a nice holiday to have.
Absolutely. So if someone's new to the concept of Juneteenth, how should it be celebrated, do you think?
I think it should be celebrated because it's a day of freedom. It's a day of liberation. And when you think about literally spending your whole life in bondage, and that's all you knew as an enslaved person, and then someone finally telling you, you are no longer a slave, you are free, you are on your own, that is just jubilation. And while we didn't have a similar story here in Nashville that, I think after the Civil War's over, we're the state capital, people knew, word spread pretty quickly. The Union Army had actually occupied the city of Nashville from 1862 to the end of the Civil War, so there was no kind of, hey, we hope they don't find out. But it's a landmark. It's a marking of time, and it's a great story.
So David, as we were talking about before we came on the air, I actually spent the day in Clarksville today doing a story on Juneteenth. Clarksville, actually one of the few communities in Tennessee that went ahead and designated it as their own local holiday anyway. So both Montgomery County and city employees for the city of Clarksville will have tomorrow off. But they, I think as this has especially gotten momentum over the last few years, they actually have a few different celebrations going on this weekend. I know Nashville has a few different celebrations as well. I mean, that's pretty remarkable that we're starting to see actual events, it seems like, around these as well.
Yeah, I think after the last year and a half of, you mentioned the marches and the protests and of course COVID, people want to celebrate and people want to kind of come together. Holidays are very important. Some honor military people, military dead, independence of our country, things like Christmas and Thanksgiving, but I think this fits very nicely with our established federal holidays.
I can't help but think, with holidays like Memorial Day and Veterans Day even, you see, some traditions that try to still, obviously it can end up being a long weekend and people take advantage of that, but there's always kind of that urge to try to take a moment to try to observe why that holiday is important. What would be your recommendation for people maybe for this Juneteenth, of what should they do to try to be mindful of what this holiday symbolizes?
I would read more on the issue of enslaved people and slavery. There's some really good narratives out there. The first that comes to mind is Up From Slavery, the autobiography of Booker T. Washington. Frederick Douglass had a narrative about being an enslaved person too, 3 volumes actually later. And just, it's kind of like the Tulsa race riots. We were talking that a lot of people did not know that this massacre happened up until recently. And this is a chance for people to kind of study more. And obviously, there are lots of people that were enslaved here in the state of Tennessee. And so it's just a good thing to study and see kind of what the world was like and kind of how far we've come.
I think you made a really great point a few minutes ago talking about how obviously the Union Army occupied Nashville for quite a bit of time during the Civil War. So there wasn't this, in contrast to what they saw in Texas of one contrast to the other. One day you woke up that morning, enslaved, and then, once that word spread, the celebration I'm sure that ensued. But when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, what do you think some of the impact of that would have been in Tennessee given some of the Union occupation at the time?
Well, it's interesting. Historians will say, the Emancipation Proclamation, was a document signed by Lincoln and went into effect on January 1st, 1863 to free all the enslaved people in the South. But, by that time they had kind of broken away and they were fighting a civil war, so it really didn't have that effect. It's like, hey, remember that president you used to follow and now you're in your own deal and you're fighting? But what's interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation was that's what African Americans, formerly enslaved people in Nashville, celebrated in the 19th century. In fact, 5 years after it was signed in 1863. We had on January 1st, 1868, Nashville had a big celebration to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, mainly African Americans. They had parades, they marched around the city, they went to the public square, they marched down Fifth Avenue, now John Lewis Way, and they went to the state capitol. And they went to the state capitol and they were in the House of Representatives chamber. They filled the galleries and there were all sorts of speeches from politicians, people from out of state, and they read the text of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, at the time, they called him the second Moses, that he freed the African Americans. So lots of reverence was made to Abraham Lincoln. And it was interesting, the press accounts of the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation basically said, the African American community is celebrating this day, and the other citizens of Nashville were not.
We mentioned this a little bit before the broadcast started, but I wanted to mention this. So you have, day, and I believe is Emancipation Day considered is that celebrated in August?
Well, it's January 1st.
January 1st. Okay.
Yes.
So is that? Is there any surprise that maybe Juneteenth has arisen kind of as the official federal holiday versus an Emancipation Day or other days that might be able to mark the significance of slavery being ended?
Well, I'm glad that this day in the middle of the year is honored. I think probably if you would ask a lot of people when was the emancipation, it was signed in, I think, June and then go into effect until January 1st of the next calendar year. But most people probably couldn't tell you when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. But, Juneteenth by its name, everybody knows. And so, like I said, it's a great holiday, and hopefully it'll bring more attention to what the struggle and legacy of slavery was. My great-great-grandfather and his twin brother were also slaves here in Nashville. My great-great-grandfather's twin brother, Taylor Ewing, was a slave out at Travelers Rest, the Overtons, and he escaped during 1861 and came to Nashville and was here shortly after the Union Army came here. So if you were a runaway slave and came to Nashville and you were in this kind of Union fortress, you basically had your freedom. They're not going to put you to work as a slave, and you can just kind of go and come as you please.
That is amazing, and I want to expand a lot more on that. We do have to sneak in our first break real quick. We'll have much more with David after this break. And a reminder, if you have any questions for David, we'd like to hear directly from you. The phone number right below us here on your screen. Give us some calls. We'll answer your questions. We'll be back in a minute.